Hey everyone. Like many of the chapters in Wayside School, they can get pretty silly and confusing. This one, chapter 6, Pet Day, can get a little bit confusing. So really try and pay attention and put the characters together if you can. But I'll show you a chart at the end that will help. Chapter 6, Pet Day. All the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class brought a pet to school. The room was very noisy. Dogs barked, cats meowed, a frog croaked, a pig squealed, a cow mooed, birds tweeted. Mrs. Jewell held up 2 fingers. All the animals became quiet. Stephen didn't have a pet, so he brought an orange. He kept it in a cage on his desk so it couldn't escape. Todd brought Ralphie, his baby brother. Todd, said Mrs. Jewell. Todd barked. You cannot have a pet human, said Mrs. Jewell. He doesn't bite, Todd assured her. Joy told Todd to sit and be quiet. Mrs. Jewell got a large piece of poster board from the supply closet. Let's make a chart, she said. Across the top of the chart, she wrote, name of kid, kind of pet, name of pet. She started with Dee Dee. She wrote Dee Dee under name of kid. And you have a dog, she said. Cat, said Dee Dee. Cat? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Dee Dee nodded as she petted her dog. Mrs. Jewell moved on to Ron. Ron, I see you have a cat. Dog, said Ron, as he stroked the cat on his lap. Mrs. Jewell shrugged. Okay, she said. He's my dog, said DJ. Ron has your dog? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Ron has a cat, said DJ. That's what I thought, said Mrs. Jewell. But what? What's a dog? Said Jenny. Mrs. Jewell covered her ears and shook her head. Let's start this all over again. She got a new piece of poster board from the supply closet. Mac, what's your dog's name? What's my dog's name? Said Jenny. What's my dog's name? Said Jenny. I'm not talking to you, Jenny. I'm talking to Mac. He can't talk, said Mac. Who can't talk? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Mac, said Mac. Billy barked at Mac. Mark barked at Billy. Todd barked at the both of them. Joy made Todd lie down by her feet. Mrs. Jewell moved on. What's your pet, Myron? She asked. Your pet's a turtle, said Shari. What? Asked Mrs. Jewell. What is Jenny's pet? Said Shari. Jenny's pet is a dog, said Mrs. Jewell. What's his name, Jenny? Jenny nodded. Her dog sat up straight and tall and seemed to smile at Mrs. Jewell. He's handsome, said Mrs. Jewell. My mouse is handsome, said Benjamin. Benjamin had a little white mouse in a cage on his desk. If you like mice, said Dana. If you like mice, said Dana, making a face. Mrs. Jewell likes mice, said Calvin. She eats them. Gross, said Dana. He won't come when you call him, said Kathy. He doesn't know his name. Billy meowed. Will Mrs. Jewell eat yogurt? Asked John. No way, said Calvin. I will too, said Mrs. Jewell. I like yogurt. I like strawberry best. Marisa beamed. Mrs. Jewell likes strawberry best, she bragged. You shouldn't pick favorites, complained Dana. Do you like crackers, Mrs. Jewell? Asked Rondi. Don't worry, said Calvin. Mrs. Jewell won't eat crackers. How do you know what I'll eat, Calvin? Asked Mrs. Jewell, a little annoyed. I like eating crackers with cheese on top. Oh, gross, said Myron. He won't come when you call him, Kathy said again. Mac, keep Mac away from my socks, shouted Allison. Wait, said Jason. Now you've got my socks and I've got your socks. I can't tell the difference between my socks and your socks, Jason, said Allison. Mrs. Jewell covered her ears and shook her head. She moved on. What's your pet, Damien? She asked. I already told you he was a turtle, said Shari. I wasn't talking to you, Shari, said Mrs. Jewell. I was talking to Damien. Your nose a ferret? Said Damien. My nose a ferret? Asked Mrs. Jewell. My nose a hamster, said Joe. Billy bleated. Mrs. Jewell licked her leg. Hey, Paul, said Leslie. I like your pigtails. Thanks, said Paul. May I touch your pajamas? Go ahead, said Bebe, who was already petting Leslie's pajamas. She won't scratch you. This is crazy, shouted Terrence. He's cute, said Dana. All right, take a look at this chart. If you want to pause the video, you can. Notice why everything was so confusing. Look at the names of the pet. Yeah, so maybe now after you see that chart, maybe go back and replay this video and it might make a little bit more sense to you. Typical Wayside School.